Hello, my name is Sue Highmore, and I'd like to welcome you to this short training session on how to get the best out of the Practical Law Service, one of the many resources available to you here at the University of Law. I hope that by the end of the session, you'll be able to find the material that is most relevant to your course really quickly. First of all, to access Practical Law, you will be clicking the My Library tag on your Elite homepage, and then click the Practical Law link that's listed under the heading Databases, which is usually in the bottom left-hand corner. Practical Law resources will be of use to you whether you're a student on the GDL, the LPC or BPTC courses, or an undergraduate student of law or a postgraduate. And some of you might already have used Practical Law, perhaps on the GDL or at university. But for many of you, this webinar will be the first time that you've seen it. And the good news is that using the Practical Law site and its search facility is really intuitive. So I think the best thing to do after this webinar is just go away and try out the site, using some of the hints and tips I'm going to give you on how to get to the material that you need by the most efficient method. And remember, though, if you get stuck, there's always someone to ask. You can either email or speak to someone from Library Services. Or you can speak to or email the Practical Law Student Ambassador who's here on campus. They will be in touch with you by email on a regular basis, but don't hesitate to contact them in between. You can contact the relevant team here at Practical Law via the Ask a Question button. Now this pops up in many places, so that it should be accessible from any screen that you are viewing. Here on the home page you'll see it's up here on the top right hand corner where the orange box appears. Now, how does this webinar work? Well, on the principle that I think the best way to get to grips with anything new is to actually use it, I'm going to illustrate using the Practical Law resources to answer a couple of typical workshop questions, very similar to those that you may encounter on your course. And you should be able to print these off by selecting the Handouts button on the webinar page. But before I do that, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about Practical Law. It's a web-based legal know-how service, both in the UK and the US. And you can see over here, that's where if you wanted to, you could access the US site. It also publishes a magazine, PLC magazine, which you can access down here. And that's how it started off, in fact. But today, we're just going to concentrate on the UK web-based service. And this is designed for lawyers in all sorts of environments. So it might be private practice, small, medium, large. It might be in-house lawyers in companies, lawyers who work in local authorities or charities or public sector organisations or government departments. For you, we market our resources to people who work in universities and colleges, whether they're students or lecturers, and also to lawyers who want to find out a bit about law outside the UK, because of course we have our international collection. So hopefully wherever you go on to work after you graduate from the University of Law, you're likely to come across and use Practical Law. So learning now will be very useful in the future. Now, although we're not going to look at them today, just to tell you that each of the specialist types of user has their own entry point to the system. So here, were you to work in-house, you would gain access immediately to the collection most relevant to them, and there are other people, but we're not going to look at those today. And who works at Practical Law? Why does it matter, actually? Well, it's a bit like anything else you pull up via Google on the web. You really need to know the pedigree of the material before you can decide whether it's safe to use it. You need to be sure it's accurate, current and authoritative. So who writes our material? Well, most of the legal content of Practical Law is written by experienced ex-practicing solicitors and barristers who are employed now as editors here at Practical Law. For example, I spent nearly 30 years at Linklaters doing complex property development work. And should you ever want to look at the background and experience of the team of editors, you can look at it on the site up here under Meet Our Team. So those editors assess what goes on the site, they read the raw material, they mug up on the law, they write the summaries, they extract the practical effect for practitioners, and then they indicate how procedure or drafting might need to change. So they bring their expertise and practical experience to bear. Some specialist material is actually written for us by leading experts in the field, and you'll always know if it's an external contributor because their name and their firm will appear in a particular field, and I'll show you an example of that later. So what is the advantage of using an external specialist? Well, for Practical Law, it means we gain access to their expertise in areas where the in-house editor team might not be quite so at home. But for the contributor, it gives them the chance to raise their profile and to write material that doesn't have a word count restraint. That's unlike writing for legal periodicals or client newsletters, where often the articles have to be quite short and therefore inherently superficial. Here, the writer can cover the issues comprehensively and offer practical advice. And the really big advantage of an online legal know-how system is that we can keep it up to date much more easily than a printed textbook. This is where the maintained resources at Practical Law come in. This means that the same editors look at it on a regular basis. They take out the stuff that's wrong, insert reference to new materials, perhaps a new case or new legislation, and add in links to new materials that have been invented elsewhere on the site that would be useful for you. So why don't we have a look at the types of legal issues that Practical Law covers? And this is where these practice areas come in, because the first sort of division that we use is between the different types of work, and this is very similar to the way a private practice law firm might divide the work between specialist departments. So you can see there are things like corporate, there's property where I work, EU law if you're doing an undergraduate degree, and when you search Practical Law, basically you'll be searching across all of the services to which your organisation subscribes. And if there's material that's relevant to more than one service, then it will be accessible from both. The really good news is that here at the University of Law, you've got access to all of them. So what resources can you find when you do search? Well, should you want to see them all laid out, I've actually got a better way of showing you this later. These are the various different types of resource available. That's just a name for the different types of material, and some of them will be very relevant to you as a student here, and others will really only be relevant to you when you get into practice. Now, it's important to remember that as the material on Practical Law is written for practicing lawyers, some of it is really too detailed for students. So on this table, the resources coloured red are the ones I think are most useful to you as students. Those in pink will sometimes be useful, and I'll explain when, and the white ones I think you should probably save up until you're in practice. And within the red column, as a very bald guide, practice notes and legal updates will be the best place to start. So I'll just run through each of the red ones so you know how they fit into the other resources that you have here to use at the University of Law. Think of a practice note as a segment of a textbook on a particular topic, and they come in different depths of detail, from overview to give you a quick general feel, to really comprehensive. And then standard documents and clauses are draft precedents with explanations of what's in them. Toolkits bring together all the links to particular practical law materials on a topic. So you don't have to spend time tracking them down because we've done it for you, and you can then easily extend your reading on that topic. Legal updates are the announcements of things that have happened that are new, so new cases, legislation, perhaps government consultation papers. So they're the current awareness service, if you like. And then we also do legislation trackers and links to legislation. So if you want to see how a draft bill's progressing or how many sections of an act are in force, you can either use that, but you have other resources available to you here that you can use instead. Now the pink ones, as and when you need them. The first one's very obvious. It's like a legal dictionary. We happen to call it a glossary. The ask, answers and ATTs may not be immediately obvious what those are. Not all practice areas have this, but I'm going to show you an example later from property, but think of it a bit like an FAQ repository of tricky questions and the answers. Before we started the Ask PLC service, practice areas used to write things called ATTs, Ask the Team, but they're very similar in that they're a subscriber's question analysed in detail, and you can still get to those on the site. And then we have the regular alerts. Now, they're ways in which you can be alerted to the fact that new material has been added. I'll say a little bit more about those very shortly. The things in the right-hand column I think you probably won't need until you're in practice. So, how do you access all these materials? Well, it's mostly via the website, which is what I'm going to show you today, but you can sign up for alerts for new content, and you have the choice of how to receive those. It might be by email or RSS feed or Twitter, and with the email you can decide how often to receive those. I do suggest, though, that you perhaps delay signing up for alerts until you're more familiar with the Practical Law service and know what sort of information you actually need to know about, and that'll save you from information overload. The most important thing to know is when are the practical law materials going to be most useful to you on your course. So we'll just run through those quickly. The first is going to be as sort of background materials to help you understand a topic. Perhaps you've missed a workshop or you've watched the course webinar and you've read the manual, but you still don't quite get what it's on about, and a different manner of presentation might suit your particular method of study rather better. So that's where practice notes will help you. Those are the textbook chapters. Or you might want more detail than you've got in your course manual. Sometimes, if you're given a particularly difficult workshop, you just need to go a little bit further. So the practical law materials can supplement what you've done. Now, I am not encouraging you to just go off and read masses of wonderful practical law materials just for the hell of it. You really don't have enough spare time on your course. You need to keep your wider reading focused. There's plenty of time for the other stuff later on when you get to work. But there's one example where you will need to go off and look for more exotic things, and that's where you have to do an extended essay. Now, this is much more relevant to the GDL students and undergraduates amongst you, but it will be really useful to delve into the detail here. For LPC students and BPTC students, you'll get asked to draft documents, and it's really quite scary asking people to draft from a blank page, so you might find it very helpful to look at a precedent on practical law, which will give you ideas of where to start. And sometimes your workshop will give you a specimen draft document and they ask you to mark it up. And that's where you'll find the drafting notes to one of our standard documents might help you decide what's not quite right in it. And then you may want to track new cases and legislation. You have other ways of doing that here. And remember, practical law doesn't cover every case or piece of legislation. If the case only covers old or established ground, we won't mention it at all. So we can't be your only source of information on these areas. But one of the advantages of using us where we do cover it is that we will give you some practical comment, and that may expand your understanding of what the impact of the case is all about. Let's put all this into practice. I'd like you to imagine that you've been given question 1 to prepare for a workshop. So question 1. Well, this is where your client has asked you for advice about a very high Leylandii hedge which his neighbour planted years ago along the boundary between the properties, and it's cutting off the light to his living room, and he either wants his neighbour to cut it back or, better still, remove it completely. And he's done a bit of negotiation, and his neighbour has agreed to dig it up and not put it back, as long as your client pays £3,000. And your client's come in to say, can I get something done without paying that money? And if not, please can you draft a suitable clause to put in a document recording the neighbour's agreement. So you've got 2 things to do. Find out whether the neighbour can be forced to take the hedge down, and if not, invent an enforceable document in which he agrees to do so for a payment. So I'm going to assume that apart from hearing people moan about this sort of thing on the news, you don't actually know the answer to this question. What you're going to have to do is do a search. So the search box appears up the top here. Now, almost everybody will start with a Google type search, and that's what this offers you. So we can't think of anything better. We'll type in high hedges. The first thing you'll notice is, just like Google, you're given the option to select various possibly helpful phrases. But just for the purposes of demonstrating what happens if you don't select those, let's search using high hedges and see what happens. Now, the first thing to always look at over here in the left-hand column is how many results did you get, because if it's more than about 30, you haven't done your job properly. So let's not go any further with the 1020 results, because that's just impossible. So why don't we go back and see whether or not we could have selected one of the phrases here and got any better. So it's offering me high hedges law. That looks quite hopeful. Let's go with that. And well, that's better. 838, but it's still not good enough, so that's no good. So the first tip I'm going to suggest is how to refine your search in a way that will, generally speaking, get you much less to look at. And this is only going to work where you have a phrase that has more than one word in it. And you put it in quote marks. This may be something you've been doing on other websites that you're using, and then you run the search. Now that's much better. Look, we've got 28 of them, so I think that's manageable. So let's have a look and see what you've got. This is called the hit list down here. And I said to you at the beginning that the thing that students, generally speaking, ought to start with if they can is either a practice note or a legal update. Now, fortunately here, you can tell what they are by looking down here. This one is a practice note, and it says high hedges complaints. Well, that looks terribly good, doesn't it? It's pretty much what your client's asking you about. So let's have a look at a practice note. So the section that follows is how to navigate your way round a practice note. Now, you know it's a practice note because it says so, and you know it's maintained. Remember I said that this means the editor goes back in and has a look at it from time to time and makes sure that it's up to date. Just a word of warning, we don't maintain every resource every day of the week. That would be impossible. So we go back in on a rolling program and mop up the changes on a regular basis. So how do you know if we've done that? Well, you come over here to the resource history. Now, if you click that, it will tell you here if there have been any changes made to this resource. Now, for this one, I happen to know that this practice note is quite recent. We haven't gone back in and maintained this yet. There hasn't been the need. But I'm going to show you one later where we have done, so that you will know how to decide whether or not it's sufficiently up to date for you. Going back up here, this bit here tells you which service, which practice area wrote the practice note. Now, you can imagine that you're doing this workshop question at 3 in the morning. And you're under some pressure to get it done for tomorrow morning, so you don't want to have to read the entire chapter in the book. What you need to do is to cut straight to the chase. So in a practice note, there's usually a bit at the very beginning that gives you an overview of what this is all about. So for argument's sake, assuming you know nothing, we've gone to that page, and I've used the intelligent index to get me to the first paragraph. And in this first paragraph, you can see that it gives me a brief description of why high hedges are a nuisance, and what you can do about it, a piece of relevant legislation, and then this interesting paragraph at the end that says local councils have a power to deal with complaints. Well, that's beginning to look quite hopeful. So we now know roughly what we're dealing with. Let's go back up to the index and see if we can find the right sort of paragraph to help us work out what to do next. Now you'll notice I scrolled back up to the index because I wasn't very far away from it. Had I been further through the document, I could have used the back button and I got back to the index. So let's have council's powers to deal with a complaint. Let's have a look at that. Now, these sections illustrate how the editor has set out what's in the legislation in nice easy bullet points so that you can identify what you've got to do. But what I want to show you is how you can jump straight to the original legislation, because you will be encouraged here at the University of Law to look at original sources. So you'll see that where it summarises what's in the legislation, it gives you the option of linking to the relevant section. Wherever you see a section with little dotted lines underneath it, that's going to link through to the relevant piece of legislation. Now you have a choice of how you look at these primary sources. You can look at it on the government website, you can look at it on Westlaw, or you can look at a summary of all the points within the PLC system that mention this particular section. So I'm going to show you each of those in case they're not familiar. So if you look at legislation.gov.uk, this is where the government plants all its statutory instruments, its statutes. I'm not going to spend a lot of this time today showing you what it does, but a couple of things I find helpful are that if you want to know whether the government issued an explanatory note, it'll be down here under More Resources. You might even find it here under Explanatory Notes. If you want the text of the legislation in full, that's where it is. And here you'll see that there's a bar that allows you to toggle between what was the original act and what it might look like now. Now that's not always available to you. Sometimes they haven't quite caught up. Let's assume you found what you want and you want to get back to your practice note. You can go back by using the back button. Now, if you would want to look at it on Westlaw because you like Westlaw better, this will allow you to link through to Westlaw and it'll behave just as you would expect. You log in and then you do what you would normally do. And to get out of that, you X out rather than going with the back button. If you wanted to know what else PLC has on this particular section, you can do that. Sometimes it's helpful to link through to other materials. In this case, it's only got the one practice note that mentions it. So you've got various different ways of finding your primary resources. Right, we've done that. I'm now going to show you something very useful if you are doing background research into the reason why legislation is the way that it is. Now you probably know that when statutes and SIs are issued, they're often accompanied by government guidance, and this is a really useful source for law students of information on things like the aims of the legislation, forms and procedures they want you to comply with, how they think this is going to make a difference to people's behaviour. Frankly, the other advantage about statutory guidance is that it's written in much more user-friendly language than the actual statute or the SI, so you may find it easier to understand. And I can illustrate this because in this paragraph here, we've actually got a link to the guidance. So you can click through and you'll find there's always an intermediate page such as this which we've set up. And then it goes out to the right gov.uk page. And now I won't do this, but if you wanted to, you could now download this guidance as a PDF. And finding this page on gov.uk is really quite tricky. Very occasionally, the government move these and they stick them on a different page. And then the URL link that I showed you working through from here doesn't work. And that's the point at which we'd really like you to tell us. And you can go over here and contact us and say this particular link is broken and then we'll put it right. There are other ways of getting to guidance. If you haven't spotted something in the paragraph, what I suggest you do is that you always look at the related content site, because the editor who wrote this practice note thinks you might need to look at this. And you'll see here various different links to guidance which will follow precisely the same pattern of going through an intermediate page and then off to the gov.uk site. That gives you a pretty good way of finding these guidance documents, but what there is often before they issue a new statute or SI is a thing called a consultation. And a consultation paper can be equally useful, particularly if you're doing an extended essay. because you may be asked to challenge the current thinking on a topic, and therefore the consultation paper is a good way of mugging up on what the law was before, why it needed changing. And the trouble is they're really hard to track down on the relevant department website, particularly if they were published some time ago. So let's see, was there a consultation paper before the Antisocial Behaviour Act? We'll go back up here, and we had High Hedges. And now we're looking for a consultation, so let's put in consultation. Don't put in and in the middle, because then it'll start looking for materials with and in it, and you'll find hundreds of them. So you just need those two together. It will add them together automatically. Let's see what we get. Good, we've only got 19. That's a good start. Right, now, the next thing to remember is that consultations, they're current awareness. They're things that have just happened. And if you remember, I said legal updates are where you find current awareness. So if you were to go all the way down your 19 results, you'd be looking for things that say legal update in the middle. Unfortunately, here we've got a legal update, consultation on. It looks very helpful. So why don't we have a look now at what a legal update does and how it differs from a practice note. So we'll have a look at that. Now, the first thing to notice is it says it's a legal update. It tells you that it was published then, and it's going to tell you, because there's no maintained statement here, that this is not a maintained resource. Now, that's often the case with legal updates. We don't go back in and update them. They are just a snapshot at the time that they were in force. And this allows you to navigate your way through and have a look at what it was all about. And you really want to look at it, don't you? So here, ODPM has published a consultation paper. Again, you can use our site to navigate through to the consultation paper from 2004. Now, I tried finding this on the gov.uk site yesterday. You can't find this. It's just not there. But because we set the link up, you can still get to it. So, success! So I'd like to show you now how to get to other wider materials that might be useful. I'm going to do this using a slightly different search term because I'm slightly bored with High Hedges. Let's assume that when you got your client in there, you were thinking, well, I don't really know what the whole legal ramifications of this are going to be, but I'm pretty sure that he's cross and it's sort of nuisance. So let's try nuisance. Now, I'm illustrating you doing what I taught you to do earlier, which is put the quote marks around the search term, but you don't need to here because it's only one word. It won't matter if you do, but you might as well not bother. It does help if I can type, doesn't it? Right, here we go. Nuisance. And we don't want nuisance noise, so we'll get rid of that very helpful suggestion. Go. Right, so you think it might be something to do with nuisance. You're going to start with the chapter in the textbook, aren't you? So common law nuisance, it happens to be a practice note. That looks hopeful. Okay, let's have a recap. You know it's maintained. This time it's written by a different service. Let's make sure it was up to date. Do you remember how to do that? You get to the resource history, and oh, look, there's lots of them. Find out when that was. Updated to reflect a new case, 2012. So that's okay, it looks pretty good. Let's go and see what's in it that might help. So again, don't go any further than the index to start with. Is there something in the index that looks relevant? So flicking down here, oh look, remedies, that looks hopeful. That's what your client wants. He wants a remedy. You might even remember, if you've done some of this before, that an injunction is something that helps people stop others doing things. So you could flick straight through to the injunction page. Now, that gives you an idea of how to navigate your way around a practice note. Let's try something slightly different. Do you remember about rights of light? This is the access of light to people's properties across other people's land. Now, that is more than one word, so we'll type it in quote marks to see what we get. Okay. Now, you've got 127 results, which is rather too many. Let's assume that you have heard in the press of a recent case where somebody was definitely allowed to stop next door building, and that's what you'd like to find. How do you find a case? Well, remember that all cases are done in legal updates. Now, you can, if you really want to, but I don't recommend it with 127 items on your hit list, scroll down until you spot something that looks a bit like a case report, and you see we're down here, and finally we found one. That's a legal update. It says it's a case report and it's a case name. But there's rather too many of those, so there's a better way of doing it. If you come down here, you can filter by the type of resource that you want. And you want a legal update, so we'll apply a filter. It says there are 33 of them. That's a much better idea. It won't just be case reports, because there are other things in legal updates. So you want to know where's the first case that might be relevant, and here you go, you've got another one. Same one as it turns out. How do you know if it's the most recent one though? You don't. But you can easily find out. Up here you can see that it's sorting the hit list by relevancy. It's trying to make a decision for you. What is the thing that is most useful to you? But you can change that round. If you click here, you can sort it by date. And now it's giving you the most recent ones first. So you now know that the first case report you hit will be the most recent case report we've done. So flick down here looking for legal update and a case name. Ah, look, there you go. That's the most recent case. Let's have a look at it. Right, we know it's a case report, we know it's not maintained, we know it was produced by PLC Dispute Resolution, and if you scroll down to the bottom, which we won't do right now because I want to demonstrate this in another context, is you could get straight through to the case report. So you've now found the most recent case, and if we were doing this for real, you could read into it and decide whether it's relevant to your client. Well, we're not going to do that because I want to show you something else. One of the advantages of using a case report on Practical Law is that you will have an opportunity to navigate the case a little more quickly at the outset and get some commercial insight into what it's about. The first of those is the speed read, which you can see down here. Now this is where the editor will have given you a snapshot of what it's about, what was decided, perhaps why it matters, and it will mean that you can get a very quick idea of whether this is actually the case that you're looking for. So I suggest they're always worth expanding and having a look at. Assuming that you do want to look further, then the next thing you might want to look at is whether or not there is a comment section down here. Now you'll see that comment section, and that's where the editors such as I are going to put their comments on why this matters to the industry, what its significance is, what you might do as a result of drafting. And this is the sort of thing that you can't get just from the case report or the transcript. But here at the University of Law, you are very much encouraged to look at the original from a resource such as this. And if you go right to the end, you will always find there is a link. And then it will go out to the transcript on Bailey. Now, just a word of warning, please remember that just like Practical Law, Law Reports, the formal series, don't cover every case. They make a decision based upon whether they think the case is going to be useful, whether it develops the law in an area. So a transcript is a record of what was said, but not every transcript makes it into the Law Report series. And not every case report will make it onto Bailey either. But the transcript is where you can read word for word what was said, what was argued. And the case reports may have some edited versions of that. The next thing I'm going to show you is how to navigate between one practical law resource and another, because you might have started off on your research trail and you want to see where to get to. Let's go back here, and now we've gone back to the case report, and I'm going to show you how to link to documents elsewhere on the Practical Law site. So down here we've got the background to the case, and this says if you want to know more about rights of light, click here and we'll go to a practice note, which is a different one. We haven't looked at this one before, and you might find that happens quite a lot. Again, nice intelligent index. You could check over the resource history. We're not going to go over all that again, but let's assume that you want to find out more about what your client can do. So if you remember, I said you probably know about injunctions, you know what they roughly are, so let's have a look at those. Now this allows me to show you how to use the glossary. Anything that's in blue is a link, and anything in bold blue is a link to a glossary term. So if you've got a vague idea what an injunction is, but you better check, you click on that and it'll give you the PLC dictionary really. So that'll tell you whether this looks good. Well, it does, so that's handy. So we'll go back to that paragraph and we'll read a bit more about injunctions, because that would be useful, because we'd like to know whether or not we can have one. So if you were answering this question for real, you can now read that, and you'll see again this bullet pointed presentation that tells you the 3 different types of injunction, just to make it easy. Right, so let's show you now how to get round a large practice note. Private rights of way. Okay, so what you want to know is, how do I get round the document, not go out to another document? This would be going out to a legal update or a practice note. This one, you'll notice, just says see a section. This is another section of the same document. So this is how to navigate quickly around the document itself. You don't have to go back to the index. You just click that and off you go. Now that's enough of how to get round a legal update and a practice note. I'm going to show you now how to draft that document. So you've found the law, you know the answer, now you've decided you need the document. How do we draft it? And this is where starting on a blank piece of paper is going to be really quite tricky. So we'll go back right to the beginning. You want a draft document, and you know that that in our world is called a standard document or a standard clause. So we'll go back. Here we had rights of light, and we had it in quotes. That all looks good, and you might choose to put a new search term in here. Before you do that, always check here. because you've still got your legal updates filter on, haven't you? And if you put a new search term in up here, you will only pick up the legal updates, which is going to cut out quite a lot of the useful stuff. And in this case, it's going to cut out all the standard clauses because they're not legal updates. So you want to clear those filters by just clearing them all like that. You can now decide what you're going to type in as your search term. And I'm not too sure where we're going to start. So, next door neighbour wants to stop him planting another hedge. So let's have restriction on planting, shall we? Let's see what happens. And it can't come up with any useful suggestions, so let's see what happens if we do that. Oh dear. 1400, that's no good, is it? Right, well, you remember what to do now, don't you? Because I've gone on and on about this. So you put in some quote marks, and you think, right, well, that must be better. Oh, that's not much better, is it? You haven't got any. Now, I can tell you that this is very rare. You almost never get nothing. It's because you've chosen a poor search term usually. So at this point, or you've got all your filters still on and it can't find anything to do with the filters that you like. So let's start by assuming that we don't like that search term. Well, I'll try trees and hedges and see what we get instead. And see what we get now. So that's the thing to do if you get nothing at all. It's very rare. Okay? So now we've got lots of things. We've got 11. But we know we only want a standard document or clause, so we might as well filter by those because that cuts it down a bit. Now we've only got 4. That's much better. I quite like the look of this. You can now use these headings at the top to give you a particular steer as to where you want to go. And yes, that's exactly what we want, so let's have a look at that. Now, this is a standard clause. And you'll notice that you've got clauses. And if I expand these, you've got drafting notes that tell you what to do with them. Now, you can open up these individually, or if you want to, you can go over here and you can either show all the drafting notes and they all pop up in little blue boxes, or you can hide them all and they'll all disappear and now you look as if you've just got a document. So you can now navigate your way round, and there's the clause that says, oh, look, please cut it down. And we'll just expand this drafting note to show you what they do. Drafting notes like this are intended to tell you when to use it. They also alert you to particularly tricky things that might come up. If you read this later, you'll notice that what this says is that sometimes a negative covenant is really a positive one in disguise, which is something that you may have met before. If you want to do something slightly different, this is again showing you how you can link out to a very slightly different document that you might want to read instead.
Now, I'm assuming that for the purposes of your workshop, this is 3 in the morning on the day before your workshop, and you've got to produce your document in a hurry, and it's got to look like your document, so you can't just copy what comes off the web page. You've got to produce a draft document, and there's a bit of magic here that I think you're going to find really very reassuring, because if you go back up here to the top, you will find that by pressing the button Open in Word, followed by that, and you will get a document that is opening in Word.
Now you can cut and paste that into your own Word document. You can add in your parties up here. You can save it. You can add some extra stuff, and then you save it onto your own desktop, and lo and behold, you've got the perfect document. So that's a really quick way of getting yourself a starting position for a draft document. Now, one thing to warn you here, getting out of this Word document, you've probably thought, oh my goodness, where's the PLC site gone down here? That's quite common. Remember, if you X out of this, you'll lose it altogether. You can do that if you've finished with it, and if you do, you'll go straight back to the website. But there's another tip. If you don't want to X out of it, your website page will be somewhere down on your bottom toolbar. It varies a bit depending on your computer. If you'd like to look at question 2, which you can download from your webinar page, we're going to use this to show you some features I haven't been able to illustrate so far. This is an EU-based question, and effectively we've got an English company called Trainaway, which is busy running train services from the UK to Germany and Austria, and it's offering discounted fares for children under 16. But under a fictitious EU regulation that I've made up for the purposes of the workshop, it's not permitted to discriminate on age grounds within the rail transport industry operating between member states. And we've got an aggrieved 55-year-old Barry who thinks he shouldn't be paying the full fare, and he thinks that this EU regulation has direct effect in the UK and is planning to sue Trainaway in England for fare discrimination. So you've been asked, can he do this? And if he loses in the UK, can he make a meal of this at the European Court of Justice? So it's basically, can a UK company be sued in the UK for breach of an EU regulation? Now, we know question 2 has got nothing to do with property, so we don't really want to stay in this environment. What we want to do is get back to the home page. Now, the quick way to do that is to point at the Practical Law logo in the top left-hand corner, click that, and you'll get back to the page we first started with. And you don't know anything about EU law for the purposes of today, so the only word that you heard that looked as if it was something technical was direct effect. So we'll put that in and we'll see what we get. Now we're going to ignore all those suggestions just to practice doing searches. And direct effect, you don't know what it means. Let's see what it says. Oh, no, we don't really like that, do we? Because we've got thousands of them. So maybe we'll go back and we'll see what happens if we put in direct effect and we take one of their suggestions. Have a look at these. Well, I quite like direct effect and EU. Let's see what that does. Search. Oh, it's not much better really, is it? I've still got far too many. So back to the same old thing. We'll put in direct effect in quotes and see what we get. Now, better, not brilliant. But this time, interestingly, by now you've spotted glossary and direct effect. Well, you don't know what it means. Let's have a look at that. So there you go. I've done this before. This will tell you what it is. It doesn't matter for the purposes of today what it is. What it does matter is, though, that it's a good clue, because with any luck it's told you where else to go to find out a bit more. So this is an opportunity to link out to another resource on the Practical Law website. So we'll go and have a look at this. This is a practice note. I'll tell you now it's enormous. You don't want to have to read the whole thing, and this index isn't really terribly helpful. There is a quick way to find things within a document. Now, we haven't tried this before. This is a bit like using the Google search across the whole of the resources. This is looking for a particular phrase or word within the one resource that you're in. So we want direct effect. So we're going to put that in that search box, and now it's just looking within this practice note. Well, we've got 51 of them. And just so as you know, you can do exactly the same here. Put in your quote marks because you've got more than one word in your search term, and with any luck that'll narrow it down. Oh, this is much better. Right, the yellow is telling you that it's mentioned at different points in the practice note. You could scroll through and have a look, but you don't have to. You just click on them and there you go, straight through to the first one, and you can scroll through to the rest. So we might as well have a look at this. It looks, it's describing what direct effect is. It's got this bulleted presentation that tells you need 3 different things. Down here it's got a case report, which because it's in blue means you can go and look at the case. We're not going to do any of that. So now you know what direct effect is. Good. I want now to look and see when was this maintained, just in case it hasn't been maintained recently. So we do this, and now you see it's been annually reviewed. That's all very helpful. So now we want to actually find out, can you sue for this in the UK? I think at this point, rather than read this practice note, before you do anything else, is have a quick look down these related topics. You might have a look at these other practice notes, and maybe one of these will look helpful. Well, you know one of the questions is, can Barry take his case to the ECJ? So maybe that might be useful. So before you start reading masses, try having a look at that, because that was something the editor thought would be helpful. Now, way back at the beginning of this session, I said I'd show you one that was written by an external contributor, which is why I've picked this one. Down here you can see that it's a joint effort between one of our services and an expert from practice. And if you want to see when the expert from practice last looked at it, over in the resource history, it tells you that they last looked at it last year. And they tend to be asked once a year to make sure that it's still okay. And you could go off and read this and find out when Barry can refer his case on to the ECJ, but we're not trying to answer the question, so I'm not actually going to show you that now. I've got one more thing to show you, which is this ask system that I mentioned right back at the beginning. So I'm actually going to pick out my property practice area, and every practice area has a home page like this. You can access it from this home page, and it's got various ways to search the resources. You could search by topic, you could search by the type of resource, but this is the one I want to do. This is where we've got all the questions and answers that we have dealt with through Ask. Please don't try and read them all. You need to find a way of getting to the ones that really matter. So when you go to the basic page, you will be given interesting recent ones. Go down here, which is how you get to the index, which is done by subject. So now you could find all the questions previously asked on a particular topic. Now I know some of these better than others because I answer some of them, so we'll have a look at energy and buildings. And this is where they collect together all the things to do with green buildings and carbon capture, things like that. And, for argument's sake, we'll take this one. Are solar panels chattels? Now that's the sort of question you might get in a workshop. It might help you, if you're doing this in a hurry, to have a look and see if we've ever answered this question. And you can read the question, and then you can see what our editor thinks is the answer, and occasionally there's then a bit of debate.
And that brings us to the end of today's training session on practical law. I hope that you found it useful, and I wish you well with your studies here at the University of Law. Thank you for listening.